Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for our Fixing Canada's Car Conundrum webinar. I'm Merran Smith. I'm the Executive Director of Clean Energy Canada, and we're a program of Simon Fraser University's Centre for Dialogue. We work to accelerate Canada's transition to clean and renewable energy. And I'm just waiting for a minute here while everybody's joining. So while we're waiting and people are joining, welcome to the webinar on Canada's Car Conundrum and fixing how we're going to fix it. So the last year has been huge for electric vehicles. Global EV sales are up almost 40% despite the pandemic. And the EU saw sales soar last year, passing China to become the world's leading EV market. Countries from the UK to Japan are announcing plans to phase out gas-powered cars by the mid-2030s or even earlier. And President Biden has now joined the ranks. He plans to install 500,000 charging stations and will make all government vehicles electric. That's almost 600,000 vehicles. And just in the past few months, all of the big Detroit 3 automakers have announced major plans to go electric. General Motors is planning to sell only EVs by 2035. Maybe you saw their ad with Will Ferrell in the Super Bowl, and it really symbols a massive shift in the way that GM is now marketing its vehicles. And Canada is a part of this action too, with recent deals to manufacture EVs at facilities in Ontario, securing thousands of auto jobs. But Canadians have a growing preference for gas-guzzling pickup trucks and SUVs. And that's driving up emissions in Canada. So the question remains, will these changes in our auto manufacturing sector be enough to get Canada on the right track? Today's webinar is going to explore Canada's EV opportunity, building on Clean Energy Canada's recently released report called Taking the Wheel, which looks at how Canada can cut carbon pollution and revitalize its auto sector. In terms of our roadmap for today, first we'll share some of the top-line findings from the report, and then we'll move into a pointed discussion with three special guests who are experts in this field. Colin McKerracher, he's the head of advanced transport for Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Flavio Volpe, president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturer Association. And unfortunately, Jerry Diaz couldn't join us today, but we're pleased to have Ken Bondy, the National Representative for Health, Safety, and Environment at Unifor. And then we'll allow some time for questions from you. So a couple of quick housekeeping things. If you've got any technical issues or questions, you can ask them through the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom webinar screens, and Carrie, our communications specialist, she'll do her best to help you out and troubleshoot them. You may need to move your mouse over the screen or towards the bottom of the screen in order for that Zoom menu to appear. And also, we'll be welcoming your questions in the final 20 minutes of the webinar. So all participants will be muted throughout it. So please put your questions, submit them through the Q&A icon. Feel free to ask questions at any time. You can start putting them in there now. And we encourage you to share highlights of this webinar on your favorite social media channel. We'll circulate a recording of the webinar and a copy of the slides to all who are registered. So please feel free to share those as you wish. And finally, if you want to stay informed about Canada's Car Conundrum, as well as all things clean energy, then make sure you sign up to Clean Energy Canada's weekly newsletter, the Clean Energy Review, and we'll circulate a link to sign up after the webinar. So if you're joining us now, thanks for participating in today's webinar. I'm Merran Smith. I'm the Executive Director of Clean Energy Canada. And now I'll turn things over to Joanna, our Senior Policy Advisor, for a brief summary of our recent report.
All right, thank you, Merran. Sharing my screen. Okay, so as Merran mentioned, in December, Clean Energy Canada released our Taking the Wheel report, which explores how Canada can rein in its transportation-related emissions and set our auto industry up to compete. The report starts by laying out what we have been referring to as Canada's car conundrum. So we're seeing two troubling trends. The first is that transportation emissions are up. Transportation already is the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. And over the last 20 years, we've seen those emissions grow by about 30%. Now, a big part of the problem is the cars that you and I drive. The International Energy Agency found that Canada's tailpipe emissions are the worst in the world. As this graph helps to illustrate, more Canadians than ever before are choosing pickup trucks and SUVs. Now, over that same 20-year period, our auto sector is down. That's the second troubling trend. We have seen production of vehicles fall by about 1 million vehicles per year. And Canada was once in the top 5 vehicle manufacturing countries in the world. Now we're not even in the top 10. Now, this is bad news for our environment and for our economy. The good news is that there's a solution: zero emission vehicles. We need to get more Canadians driving EVs, and we need to build more of those cars here. Now, EVs present real opportunities. From a consumer perspective, we found that Canadians can save between $800 and $2,000 a year on fuel because EVs cost less to fuel, and another couple $100 per year on maintenance since they need less frequent repair. EV drivers will also reduce their carbon footprint as EVs produce less carbon pollution than gas-powered cars. And this is true no matter where in Canada you live. Even in provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan, EVs still come out ahead on carbon pollution. And as those provinces phase out coal from their electricity grids and Canada's grid gets even cleaner, so too will the electric cars plugging into it. EVs present economic growth opportunities for Canadian industry as well. In many ways, Canada is perfectly positioned to capitalize on EVs. We've got all of the metals and minerals that go into EVs and their batteries. We've got top battery research and tech innovation talent. We've got a strong auto parts supply chain that's already pivoting towards electrification. And of course, we now are going to be seeing some EV assembly here in Canada as well. Now, when you look at the countries that are leading on EVs in the world, many of which also happen to build cars, they're putting in place comprehensive packages that help to boost EV sales while also ensuring that their domestic auto companies are capturing some of the economic benefit. So in other words, they are supporting EVs not only for the climate and environmental benefits, but also as part of an industrial strategy that sees EVs as the cars of the future. Unlike these jurisdictions, so far, Canada has lacked the national effort needed to fully harness the EV opportunity. We have taken some steps in the right direction, but what Canada really needs is a clean cars policy package that addresses both the supply and the demand side barriers to EV uptake. Now, you don't need to read all of the policies on this screen right now because we'll share the slide deck after, but just to highlight a few of the most important ones in this clean cars package: consumer incentives that reach more Canadians and a faster build out of charging stations will make it easier for Canadians to choose an EV. A zero emission vehicle standard Requiring automakers to sell an increasing percentage of EVs and stricter vehicle pollution regulations will ensure that automakers are pushing more EV makes and models into the market for Canadians to buy. Now, these policies can be paired with an auto sector strategy that leverages our automotive heritage, our high-skilled workforce, and our metals and minerals. This, in Clean Energy Canada's view, is how we will fix Canada's car conundrum. Now, that's all from me. Merran, I will turn things back to you.
Great, thanks a lot, Joanna. So now I'm going to turn to our experts in the field, and I'll invite our panel to turn on your cameras. Today, we're joined by Colin McKerracher, the head of advanced transport for Bloomberg New Energy Finance, Flavio Volpe, president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturer Association, and Ken Bondy, national representative for Unifor. So thanks so much to all of you for being here with us, and I'm looking forward to an exciting discussion. So first up, question is for Colin. Can you tell us what are some of the trends you're seeing on clean transportation and electrification globally? What are the indicators that we should be paying attention to gauge the transition to zero emission vehicles? Now, there's so much going on right now. I'm really looking forward to seeing how you can summarize it.
Yeah, and this is the fun part of my job, is that there's a lot happening and we're trying to keep track of it all across the world. So I lead a global team of analysts tracking e-mobility developments in each market. And there's a few things I'd say that we really need to watch. One of them is the sales figures, right? So there's about 3 million passenger EVs sold last year. That's up a fair bit, and there looks like they're accelerating out of the pandemic rather than being derailed by that. But there is big regional divergences. So you're seeing a big surge in Europe, still pretty strong numbers in China, but relatively muted growth almost everywhere else. So sales, top line sales figures is still something certainly we're watching. That's running at about 4% of global vehicle sales right now, have a plug. The other thing is batteries. So batteries are still getting a lot better. We started tracking battery data. My team started tracking battery data back in 2010. So lithium ion battery prices have fallen almost 90% since then. And density on a gravimetric basis is going up at about 4 or 5% per year. And that's really starting to compound. So the sales, one thing to watch. The underlying technology still improving. The commitments are also still going up. So, I mean, just in the last few weeks, GM making strong commitments with its 2035 target. In the UK, Jaguar saying becoming an all-electric brand by 2025. Ford also now in Europe saying we're going to go 2030 battery electric vehicles only in Europe. So commitments from automakers, and those are also being driven by national commitments as well. Then the last thing I'll just flag is that electrification is spreading beyond other segments than just passenger transport. So one of the things and some of the most interesting areas we're actually seeing are not just privately owned passenger cars. So they are things like ride-hailing vehicles, things like buses, and 2- and 3-wheelers. And some of those segments are significantly ahead of passenger vehicles in terms of total adoption. So of all the passenger vehicles on the road, about 0.8% of them are electric right now. About 20% of the 2-wheeler fleet is electric, and about 16% of the global bus fleet is electric. Mostly driven out of China, but still pretty high levels when we're talking about the fleet overall. So those are the main things I'd highlight. The top line sales, what's happening with the underlying technology, automaker commitments, and related to that, national commitments from governments. And then this other factor, which is seeing electrification spread to other segments, because there are some reinforcing trends and benefits as different segments take this up as well. So those are the main things we're watching to kind of see where this is going and see what track we're on.
Great, thanks. So Flavio, Canada's been slower to the gate than other countries on electrification, but some recent announcements by major automakers are really shifting the tide here. So how does this set Canada's auto industry up for future success? And in your opinion, what needs to happen next to maintain the momentum?
So Canada's got one of the world's 10 biggest auto sectors by number of units produced in a year. And we're a big player, of course, in automotive parts and systems. And a lot of those parts and systems are in advanced systems in alternative propulsion, emerging in battery technologies, hydrogen fuel cell space. What's important is that all of that background and platform, there's no Canadian OEM. So when Canada lags, it's because there isn't a headquarters of a global OEM in Toronto or Ottawa or Montreal or Vancouver or Windsor that says, okay, look, we've got 65 plants around the world and we make 5 million cars and this is what we're going to do. We are part of the cascading decision dynamic. We don't influence it from a corporate point of view. Where the suppliers, in North America's second largest IT cluster, and where some really fundamental capabilities in both battery and in the fuel cell help to move the dial is, we try to demonstrate to our customers, our automaker customers, look, here's what's possible. So as you plan your next program for a Ram truck or a Nissan sedan, this is what we've been able to figure out on energy density. This is what we've been able to figure on the range of a hybridized car and the tailpipe emissions. And really importantly, a lot of this stuff also comes down to the weight of a vehicle. And the heavier a vehicle, the more torque is required to push it. The more torque in an internal combustion engine is usually more displacement. And so we lead in advancing lightweighting ideals and studies in metallurgy and plastics. And so there's a lot of angst, of course. I spent some time working for the provincial government and for the federal government throughout my career. You always sit there and say, what can we do more? One thing that you can't change as you start to think about what you could do more, and by the way, we could do lots more, is we don't have a Canadian OEM to help influence the global dynamic. We respond to other people's decisions. And when we make cars here, we sell 75% of them to the US customer. And so it's really important, if you want to change the mix of what's made in Canadian plants, is to understand what American consumers want, because that's what's made in Canada. We don't buy the cars that we make, with apologies to Toyota Corollas and Honda Civics, which are very popular in this country. Over 85% of what the American companies make get exported. So there isn't a direct line between what we would like to do and what we can affect for Canada. But we certainly, because we're one of the world's largest, we do have a moral imperative and a moral authority to be able to weigh in with other major countries in the world.
Great, thanks. So Ken, I'm wondering what you see as Canada's strengths in the transition to zero-emission vehicles, and where are our biggest opportunities?
Yeah, thank you. And first of all, greetings to everyone from our national president, Jerry Dias, who unfortunately couldn't make it today. I know we have a lot of Unifor members that are watching this webinar. And to the question, I have to always refer back to the biggest bonus that we have is that we have generational workers in auto manufacturing in this country. The big auto manufacturing centers that we've all heard about and are always on the radar. But along with those workers that are highly skilled and trained, we also, as this webinar is proof of, we are not afraid of the challenge of change. And so the opportunity that we took through the last set of Detroit 3 bargaining to bring more than $6 billion of investment in electric vehicles manufacturing to Canada is proof of that. But we also have a lot of other opportunities in Canada that can help pitch the reason why we should be manufacturing and selling electric vehicles here. Canada has a large hydroelectric source. When we constantly hear people criticize about dirty energy and how are you going to charge those vehicles, that's not the case here in Canada. It's not much of the case in certainly the more advanced states that we would be selling to. The other thing that everybody has seen is that we have garnered government support. The federal government is on board, and the province of Ontario climbed on board as we were trying to secure those investments and broaden that footprint on those manufacturing opportunities. So we have that here. The one thing that I think we're going to be able to expand on and give those opportunities is the reports like the one that Clean Energy Canada has put out that profiles the discussions on electric vehicle manufacturing and hopefully encourages the dealerships to expand on the opportunities to people to buy those products as we move forward through the manufacturing processes.
Great. Thanks, Ken. Colin, I'm thinking that you must have been looking at President Biden's inauguration and the announcements they've been making there. He's committed in his campaign to create 1 million American automotive jobs. And I'm just wondering, what do you think the implications of this promise are going to be, as well as his other commitments around climate and electric vehicles? What would be the implications for Canada?
Well, I mean, firstly, on the overall climate targets and electrification, I mean, something we've done a lot of work on was looking at the US Obama-era CAFE standards and looking at the level of electrification you would have needed to hit them, or the California tailpipe standards, and if they were applied nationally. And obviously, there's a very huge difference between what would be required under those and what would be required under the Trump rule, the SAFE rule, as it was called. So the first thing you will see is a tighter federal fuel economy standard. Whether that will be the California one or somewhere in between that and the SAFE rule, everybody's lobbying and pushing their positions right now. I think they'll go rather aggressive on that. What that probably means for Canada is that Canada will have to take a choice on whether it wants to follow that or a more aggressive standard. And I think that the implications of that will be quite big for obviously for the automotive sector in Canada. And so there's that, and then there's an element of demand creation that is going to start to go on in the US through some of these policies. So things like the government fleet procurement, vehicle fleet procurement part, that is sending a pretty strong signal that for some of these classes of vehicles, there's going to be significant demand. But one of the challenges that I see for Canada is that there is this push for sort of made in America, and the exact way that's going to be interpreted, I don't know. And that's sort of one of the things we're watching too. And I imagine both Ken and Flavio have some thoughts on as well. But that's certainly an area we're watching closely. But overall, I think what I see out of the Biden administration is that their ambition starts to line up more closely with what we're seeing in other parts of the world. And the auto markets are global. And so the big producers, regardless of where they're headquartered, are starting to make decisions, and you're starting to see the results of those decisions that reflect the fact that you almost need to design for the most stringent level of standards in different countries because the race keeps tightening. So I think that's one of the things that I see as well. One of the implications of the Biden administration signaling so far is that the US has been sort of the odd one out if we think of the big auto markets between Europe, China, and US, or more broadly North America, but that it starts to signal a change in that, I guess. And on electric vehicles, there has been a huge delta between the levels of adoption we've seen in Europe and China and the ones that we've seen in North America. I think that persists for a little while, but there are some factors about the North American EV market and the Canadian EV market that I think are really interesting to consider. One of them is that you do have a lot of two-car families, right? So there's a scenario where one of those cars can go electric quite easily. It's used for the commute, lots of miles shift over to it. So there's the dynamic there where that might be easier than in some big Asian cities or in parts of Europe. And also that you do have a lot more people with home charging options. So there's a lot more single detached homes in Canada and in parts of the US than there is in Europe and in parts of Asia. So I think there's a shift in ambition that means that North America starts to close that gap a little bit. I think it persists for a while, but I also think there's a scenario where some of this stuff really starts to accelerate in North America in the second half of the 2020s as the economics of electric vehicles continue to get better.
Great, thanks, Colin. Flavio, you might have something to add on the Biden signals and how that'll affect Canada, but I also wanted to ask you about Project Arrow, this banner project for Canada's auto sector, and what opportunities it will help unlock and how it can influence the future of Canada's auto industry.
Appreciate that. I'll say this on the Biden piece. I think Colin's right about what the intentions of the president are. The president was a key part of the administration, of course, number two in the former administration, that decided, look, if we're going to cut checks for $40 billion to restructure a couple of the major automakers and reset the dynamics after the Great Recession, then we want something in return. And what they targeted was, let's take the corporate average fuel economy from 27 miles per gallon to 54 and a half in a course of 14 years. That in the auto business is about 2 or 3 generations of vehicles. Very, very aggressive. The industry, when I took over this job 5-6 years ago, the biggest issue in the industry was, look, we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars to get to that target. And that aggressive target had some very serious penalties for not meeting it. What was contemplated was, if you don't meet the target in that year, whatever specific year, then you would not be allowed to sell cars, which was different than what it used to be, which was, by the way, you don't meet that target, we're going to levy a fine to you. In 2009, for example, BMW paid a fine of $31 million to the EPA and just amortized it into the price of the vehicles that they sold. So some really aggressive standards then started to cause for a change in behavior for a lot of the automakers. But the difficulty in achieving those targets through the years, regardless of the slant of the Trump administration, is that automakers do not control and I think they hope that they could, but they don't control the behavior of the consumer. So if the consumer doesn't buy the vehicle, then you get judged on what the pool of consumers did. And consumers aggressively moved from smaller vehicles to larger vehicles and into CUVs and crossovers, because the price of gas in the US, I mean, let's say what it is. The price of gas in the US facilitated that. And consumers when they like those vehicles, I'm getting back to Biden here in a second. Those consumers, they like those vehicles. They don't like those vehicles because they have a V8 or because they're big. It's the experience with the vehicle. If you're sitting in a vehicle and you've got lots of room and you've got a high seating position and you like the feeling of torque, well, you could deliver that in zero emission vehicles. And we're going to see a lot of the companies that are making these commitments say, well, we're going to build, look, General Motors said we're going to build you a 1,000 horsepower e-Hummer. It's incredible. So Biden says, President Biden says, we're going to move federal procurement into EVs. And there are American companies that made very significant billion-dollar investments in Canada over the last 2 months. General Motors with commercial fleets, Ford with the replacement of CUVs in Oakville, and Windsor on a type of vehicle that gets used by fleets. Those companies didn't do that in a vacuum, and Joe Biden didn't make the commitment in a vacuum. What we're going to see is what we've seen traditionally is a waiver-like relationship between Canada and the US on this, because Joe Biden and his administration, who we've already been in contact with, understands that those cars are made by American companies that repatriate profits to the US under US law, with about 60% US parts and 50% US raw materials. So the American future, as driven by the Biden administration, will benefit the Canadian industry. Project Arrow is us, after 5 or 6 years of building demonstration vehicles using Lexuses built in Ontario, and saying, look, if you've got connected autonomous technology that you want to present to your customers, but not on a PowerPoint, you want to put it on a vehicle, we'll build a fleet and we'll demonstrate it. Last year, I went to the throne speech, December of 2019, and the Prime Minister said, we need to target a zero emissions economy by 2050, and there are various sectors that are critical to that need to be more aggressive. We said, fine, we're going to build a car to Canadian motor vehicle safety standards for 2025, designed, engineered, and supplied exclusively by Canadian suppliers, technology, designers, schools. And in October this year, we revealed the design, and we've assembled a team that's going to build the car and its digital twin, and it will tour the auto show circuit through the end of 2021, 2022, and 2023, saying this: Canada can and will supply every single component in the new vehicle economy. Can we do it, every single component, profitably versus Mexico, China, Malaysia? Maybe we can. But batteries, fuel cells, drive, all of those technologies that help to maximize the efficiency of those vehicles, yeah, we're going to do it here. And we named it after the Avro Arrow, which was another clean sheet that had a different ending, but a clean sheet that the effort that drew all the best Canadian technology minds together. You know, that project ended without going into production, but 19 of those engineers put Americans on the moon, and a whole bunch of them went and built a Concord program for the Brits. And so we're going to do something, a Team Canada approach here. And so far, we've got 253 companies across this country involved in the project.
Great, really exciting, Flavio, thanks. So we've got lots of questions coming in from the audience. I've just got 2 left before I'll go to the audience questions. So Ken, I'm wondering, globally, we're seeing countries grappling with the transition of industries, automotive included, and many countries have actually developed an automotive industrial strategy to help guide their transition. Should Canada do the same? And what are some critical components you think it should include in that kind of strategy?
Yeah, so we have long been on the record of calling for the federal government to develop a national transportation strategy, and there's many different parts that would put together to make things happen. And we're still calling on that. And in the need for that to happen, we are again taking those steps to explain to the public and to bargain with the manufacturers that we can have those opportunities. And this is not something new. For an example, back in 2011, the Ford St. Thomas plant that used to build these big Crown Victorias, and if you ever went to New York City or downtown Toronto, all of the taxi cabs were Crown Victorias. All of the police cars were Crown Victorias. But the decision was made that that plant was going to close. At that time, just to show you that we were forward thinking back then, we proposed to Ford Motor Company that they could convert that plant to building what they were just coming out with, a new service vehicle, the Transit. We could build that, to convert those production lines to build that vehicle. Windsor is a major engine manufacturing hub. We could build the batteries in there, and there was no interest at that time. So, I mean, a reflection of how we have advanced with or without the leadership of government plowing the way. But we want to challenge what we are seeing happening in China right now, where they have battery development strategies and protocols. And certainly Canada is on the cusp of being able to do the same thing. We know that in Canada, we have all of those rich resources that are necessary to build the batteries that we have today. And so one of the arguments that we want to make is that unlike all of the other, or a lot of the other natural resources that Canada holds, rather than just exporting those resources for development somewhere else, that we should be developing them here. So the transition of where there may be less jobs in manufacturing an electric vehicle versus an internal combustion engine vehicle can be made up if we retain the manufacturing properties of the batteries as well. And just on the last part, to go back to what Flavio was saying, and I love that that project references the Avro Arrow, because that is the intellectual properties and the intellectual treasures that we have in Canada. We have some of the best minds of development of vehicles in this country, and we should not be losing that intellectual gold. We should be using it here and retaining the research and development and eventually the manufacturing that would follow that. So every day we talk about that to our members and to the public, that an educated citizenship, an educated workforce should draw that interest and support and eventually draw that manufacturing commitment into Canada.
Great. Thanks, Ken. So last question to you, Colin, just a quick one. We know that China has been overwhelmingly dominating when it comes to EVs. Which other countries do you think are poised to lead on zero emission vehicles, and what are they doing right?
Yeah, China is quite interesting because it is, as was mentioned by both Ken and Flavio, there's sort of an industrial policy angle to it. I think there's also what you see in China is that there's other drivers too. One of them is around reducing oil dependence and oil imports, another one around clean air, and probably lastly around CO2 reductions overall. I think the places that are doing this the best, or not, that's the wrong wording, but where I see a lot of leadership right now coming are different European countries. I'm seeing that really accelerating. I sit in Europe, I sit in London, and what's viewed as possible over the last 18 months has changed dramatically. So you exited 2019 or 2020 in December, quite a few markets up in the sort of 10 to 20% of vehicle sales being electric. That's up from just a few percent the year before. That's December data. Some of those are just trying to get in under the wire so that the automakers don't pay significant fees for missing their CO2 target. But so far, 2021 is off to a pretty strong start as well. And what those places have going often is some combination of what you might call a bonus and malus scheme. So France is a good example of this, where there is a demand support for buying an EV. There are EV subsidies, zero emissions vehicle subsidies that apply to both electrics and fuel cell vehicles. But there are also significant penalties as you go up higher and higher in terms of the grams of CO2 per kilometer driven of the larger vehicles. And just to kind of give everyone a flavor of what that looks like, if you buy the largest Land Rover in France right now, you're looking at somewhere between an additional $20,000 or $30,000 or euros in fees based on the CO2 footprint of that vehicle. Now, as you get down, that goes down a lot. So that's just for the sort of highest, the most polluting vehicles. And obviously that may not be sustainable for all countries, but what that is pushing is pretty high degrees of electrification in some of those segments. So that high-end segment, those very large vehicle segment, those are all going plug-in hybrid in the next few years. And then as that tightens further, probably in the latter half of the 2020s, those will even more of those will go electric. So I think it's the countries that are targeting, that have a full suite of policy support around this, both sticks and carrots. I think it's also fair to note that there is a lot of domestic favoritism that goes on, and groups trying to promote their domestic champions. And I think that's just one of the realities of the global auto industry, and is nothing new. It's just the same thing playing out with electric vehicles that we've seen in other places. So certainly there are some countries that I think are actually going to go significantly faster than China. And I would just also say this is going to keep accelerating. So we've been tracking this battery data for a long time. Every time the cumulative volume of manufactured batteries doubles, the cost comes down by about 18%. That's what we've observed over 10 years now, tracking every vehicle sold, every EV sold in the world, and all the stationary storage projects in the world. That really is starting to push the economics to be better and better. And you're going to start to hit price parity in some segments in the next 3 or 4 years. So I think everybody needs to come at it with that mindset that whatever you think is the trajectory now, it's probably going to keep accelerating. The problem is it goes unevenly. Some places jump forward and other places jump forward. But you do have to keep that in mind, that the window of what's possible is changing pretty quickly.
Great. Well, thanks, Colin. It's been a great discussion so far, and as you can see in the Q&A chat, there's a lot of questions coming in from the audience. So I'd like to invite Joanna back in case there's questions for her about the report. And I'd also like to welcome Sarah Petrevan. She's Clean Energy Canada's Policy Director, and she'll take it away with leading the question and answer.
Great, thanks, Merran. We have received a stunning amount of questions, so we're going to do our best to get through them as soon as we can. So let's kick it off. Given the integrated auto market between Canada and the US and the policy direction being set by the Biden administration south of the border, for each panelist, maybe just briefly, what do you see as Canada's opportunity in the global shift to zero emission vehicles?
Let me take a shot at that because we do this. It's a question that we have every day, you know, and we make vehicles for the national industry here makes vehicles for the American consumer. The American regulators are up until the election of Joe Biden spent the last 3 years working between two poles. The Trump administration, which was backing off the Obama targets at 54 miles per gallon by 2025. And California said, look, we're going to go at it alone. They didn't go alone. They've got 22 states saying, well, we're going to follow California, and the rest we're going with Washington. And then we had a series of automakers that were going with California and the others that were sticking with Washington. What we're going to see is over the next year or so is peace between Sacramento and Washington. And we think one national standard there. And that one national standard is always, our advice to the Canadian government has always been, look, let's be aggressive, okay? But let's not put ourselves on an island. Let's figure out where that American debate goes. And it'll probably ends up with California. The story of the last 40 or 50 years is California's leadership drives the industry there, and then join the highest standard. And so we continue to say the same thing there. One of the things that Colin has said is that the industry is kind of accelerating on its own right now. Really just in the last couple of years, you see a lot of major automakers and a lot of major automaking jurisdictions like Japan say, okay, look, we've got our major automakers saying that we're going to go to zero emissions. You know, sometimes they decide what technology and sometimes they just say zero emissions. And we've got those major jurisdictions saying, look, by the mid-2030s, you can't sell us solely internal combustion engine vehicle here. We're going to see that happen in the US. We think that Canada should join those conversations at the highest levels with the most aggressive targets. Just don't put Canada past the California target, because what you end up doing is isolating a market that has no relationship between what's made and what's bought here, and no ability to influence. As much as I love what we're doing with Aero, and as great as Magna, Linamar, Martin Rea, Woodbridge, all these billion-dollar Canadian suppliers are, we can't influence that decision at all. So you can go out and get the headlines to be the ones that went 1% further than California, but they do come at a cost to industry. So, you know, we've got to do this aggressively, but thoughtfully.
You know, I just would like to add, because I'm very much aware that there's a lot of anxiety when President Biden, you know, came out with the Buy American campaign. And there's, as Flavio's touched on a couple of times, there's number one, big industries don't make big moves without knowing what's going to happen in the future. So for GM, Chrysler, and Ford to invest $6 billion into Canadian auto manufacturing, you should not think that they weren't anticipating that there's going to be a change in administration. And may I remind everybody that the last administration in the United States was more pro-American than probably we've ever seen before, and we were relatively untouched by that. But the last thing I want to say that people in the auto industry are very aware of, there is a reason why the auto manufacturers build in Canada and export to the consumer base in the United States. And that is because Canada is a very attractive place to make profit. We have a universal healthcare system that doesn't rest on the backs of the employers. We have a favorable exchange rate when they bring those big vehicles across, and they see the difference in the dollar amounts that they're doing things. And finally, what has just hit the auto sector in a large way is that there's a massive microchip shortage. The majority of those microchips being manufactured offshore into China and Thailand. And there should be an argument, and I think there is an argument going on right now, that if you brought that manufacturing back into land-based facilities, it takes a whole less amount of energy to transport something across a Canadian-US border than it does to ship it halfway around the world. That crisis would not be impacting and costing the auto manufacturers millions of dollars of downtime right now if that was located back here. And the last thing I'll say is that why would microchips be manufactured in Canada goes back to, once again, is the intellectual value that Canadians are educated on and can provide.
Colin, anything to add?
No, I think it's very well said. I do think Canada is pretty unique in the battery supply chain, in a high percentage of clean power already. Those are big advantages in a world where we're going towards life cycle emissions of everything becoming more important, not just tailpipe emissions. And to be clear, the life cycle emissions of an EV, even in a place that has a significant amount of fossil power generation in the mix, are still more favorable than a traditional internal combustion engine when you're looking like for like across models and comparing well-to-wheel emissions for both. Multiple studies confirm that. But I do think Canada has an advantage in having already mostly decarbonized the power sector, and in some provinces like BC and Quebec, pretty much fully decarbonized the power sector. That is a significant advantage for a world that cares a lot more about life cycle emissions, and not just for the final assembly of the cars, but for the materials like aluminum that go into those vehicles as well. And then the last thing I would just say is, there is really interesting stuff in Canada going on around non-passenger vehicles, around buses, around off-road vehicles, around boats. So obviously the big numbers, the big money, the big emissions reductions, all the main thing that's going to drive that is a change in passenger vehicle fleet. But in terms of some of the industrial policy benefits and the employment benefits, I wouldn't ignore some of these other sectors, because we do have some really promising companies in Canada, and some of those other sectors like marine are going to be bigger in the future as well. And electrification is starting to make inroads there too.
Great, thank you. So then just one quick follow-up question for each panelist, and I'm going to ask you all to answer this in 30 seconds or less. What are the top 3 policies that could be put in place that governments could do to bolster EV manufacturing and supply chains in Canada? Flavio, you want to start? We'll go in the same order.
That's a big challenge, 30 seconds. I'll say this.
30 seconds.
We talk about the most important part of an EV, if you're picking EV rather than fuel cell, is where's the battery chemistry? We got a lot in mines and in the ground in Northern Ontario and Quebec. And none of these mining companies or charities are not-for-profits. You've got to fix the pro forma for them. Getting that chemistry into a battery pack, into a company that can deliver at scale for Ford is going to be critical. And we've got 3 or 4 years to do it. And Ford won't pay for that. The supplier won't pay for that. These are publicly traded companies that have to show profitability or they're gone. And that's where the role of government is. And then one more thing on, we talk about the dirtiest fleet, and we talk about EV incentives. If you do a $10,000 incentive on 50% of the purchases in Canada a year, that's a 1 million vehicles. That's $10 billion. You probably would do a lot better by taking some of the older vehicles off the road that drive that CO2 up, because the average age of ownership of a vehicle in Canada is now getting to about 15 years. So targeting some of that money, some of that EV incentive money towards getting the older fleet off the road, and then giving people that money on a trade-in on a new vehicle that emits lower carbon is something we've seen that worked.
Okay, Ken?
So very similar thoughts. I'll go back to the strategy issue once again, because I don't think we've developed that to the degree that we have, because the goal here should be for us is not to just to attract investment from Ford, GM, and Chrysler, but those offshore manufacturers that employ little to no Canadians to build their products that are sold to our citizens. So that strategy should be more than just simply throwing dollars at corporations and expecting that that's going to improve their commitments. So that strategy is critical. That's number one. Number two is obviously infrastructure build, so that we can address people's range anxieties with electric vehicles. That's improving, but if we can put cell towers all across this country and maintain them, then we should be able to put electric vehicle stations all across this country and maintain them, not just the lower southern border ends of Canada. And third is going back to what we said, is that we need to move those older vehicles off the road. The manufacturers are showing that they can develop vehicles that have high torque, high power, that are fully electric. But the way that we have to move those older vehicles off the road, and encouragement is another project that we're very interested in called end-of-life vehicle recovery. And that is to take those vehicles off the road, recycle them, and dismantle them and recycle them, and give some type of a incentive to the owner to do that, to trade that vehicle in and to move to a new, cleaner, more efficient vehicle.
So all the good ones are taken now. I'll try and be really quick. A push for domestic battery production. There's huge competition in this area right now, whether that's in the UK or in Sweden or in France. Groups trying to locate domestic battery production, battery gigafactories. Do that, or you'll get left behind in a big part of the value pool that's being created. If not that, then push to be a place where we can recycle batteries at least, so we're not constantly importing them into Canada. Push for building codes that are ready for charging. Obviously, that's not a federal program, but at the city level, encouraging that so that the building stock turns over slowly, but at least the new builds should be ready both for private developments or private homes and multi-dwelling units to be able to have set up to have charging options. And then sort of in line with what Ken said, incentives for the used vehicle market for EVs in that market are really important. I think the transition to electric is inevitable, but what's not inevitable is that everybody's happy about it. And I think bringing people along on that journey, the sort of just transition part of it is going to be one of the most important things over the next 10 years.
Sarah,
Sarah, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that, everyone. Okay, so another question. So maybe Colin, this one's for you, but other panelists, please feel free to weigh in. How does the panel see the electric vehicle versus hydrogen fuel cell competition in the auto sector working out?
Sure, I can give my high level thoughts. So right now there isn't really a competition. There are about 30,000 fuel cell vehicles on the road across all vehicle classes in all countries, and that's after pretty significant efforts to promote them in different countries and significant incentives. Just for a sense of scale, that's about weekly EV sales this year. And if you were to double the number of fuel cell vehicles on the road every 2 years from now out to 2040, they would be around 1% of the global vehicle fleet. Doubling fleets every 2 years is really hard. So if we're realistic about the role, at least in the passenger vehicle segment, these are going to play. A really optimistic adoption scenario, doubling every 2 years, would have them at 1 to 2% of the global fleet in that year. So I don't think in the passenger vehicle fleet, they're going to play a very significant role. In heavier vehicles, they might. And this is an area where there's a lot of money being thrown around. There's a lot of competing alternatives. It's not a foregone conclusion in either direction. You could have a number of different solutions for the heaviest vehicles. So I'm thinking heavy duty long haul trucking here. That could be fuel cell vehicles. It could also be battery electric. Right now, the technology doesn't quite get you there, but it's advancing pretty quickly. You're also seeing groups starting to try and do battery swapping in China for heavy duty trucks, generally going shorter distances right now. And then, of course, you have things like overheaded catenary lines and as well biofuels for those heavier segments. So that's kind of the battleground segment right now, and that's a really interesting area to watch. It's really important. There's a lot of value created there, and of course, Canada has been a leader in fuel cells for a long time. But I think it's really down to those heavier vehicles that we're talking about now, and some non-road applications as well for hydrogen, whether that's aviation or shipping and others. But I don't really see a lot of competition in the passenger vehicle segment. Automakers are still keeping their programs alive, but I see that mostly as hedging bets rather than because they're going to make a full-throated push on it in the next 5 years.
Great, thanks, Colin. So we maybe have time for one or two more questions. This one came in specifically for Flavio. And the question is, I know that Ford and others have made media releases extolling their net zero status for various assembly plants by predetermined dates. This is very commendable and should be encouraged. But are there plans to extend this mindset down the supply chain by slowly introducing energy efficiency and renewable energy quotients as a factor in supply contracts and partnership decisions?
Good question. I think that underscores the fact that the supply chain's operations are not as public as the automakers are. And certainly that's the nature of our business. You get a contract with Toyota or Ford, you supply them, let them do the talking. The fact of the matter is that over the last 10 to 15 years, especially in Ontario, there has been a real march in operations in the supply chain to, whether it's through government programs like Global Adjustment to be able to bring some of your energy costs down by reducing your peaks, or for the types of metrics that a company like Ford, who says, look, we're going to be out there and say that our footprints are zero emissions. The last thing that we need is for our suppliers to be the gotcha statement from analysts and journalists. And so there's a lot of push from the automakers as well to get the supply chain to do the same things. But it really, in reality, in Canada, we have a table called the Canadian Automotive Partnership Council. Ken Unifor is there, academia is there, sales or dealers are there, but also automakers and suppliers. And there, we share our best practices ideas on how to reduce that footprint, because it's one of the key goals of the Canadian operations, kind of a bit of a Canadian branding, that if you're going to operate in this country, one of the competitive advantages that we try to sell to our global automakers is not only do we have governments that have cleaned the grid, and not only do we have other provinces that have specializations either in fuel cell or batteries, but we consider our factories part of that cradle to grave discussion. And you'd be pleased to see if you could you'd come in and see with some of these private companies what we're doing for all the right reasons.
Thanks, Flavio. Okay, we've run out of time. Great discussion, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to submit these excellent questions, and sincere apologies that we weren't able to get to all of them. With that, I'm going to bring today's webinar to a close. I'd like to sincerely thank our guests, Colin, Flavio, and Ken, for joining us. It was a real pleasure having you. For participants, just so that you know, there is an email coming with a copy of the recording of today's webinar, a PDF of the presentation, and a short survey that will take less than 3 minutes of your time. Again, we welcome participants to post and share your favorite highlights from today's discussion on social media and with any other parties that might be interested. With that, thank you all very much for joining us today. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.